Yes.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our online masterclass on reporting on development issues with P. Sainath. We are very happy to see so many of you sign up for for the masterclass, and it just gives us more confidence about how topics like this needs to be discussed. I request all the participants to please put their names and what organization they are from in the chat box as a small introduction. Also, please don't hesitate to put all the questions you have in the chat box. We'll take up those questions at the end. We would also request people to keep their videos on as talking to little boxes on the screen gets a little boring. Thank you. The session is also being live streamed on YouTube, so it will be available later if you want to go back to it. Before we go any further, I would like Dr. Sharda, CEO of Population First, to begin with the opening remarks.
Thank you, Hetal. Um, Welcome, everyone. And as Hetal has said, we are really very happy that so many of you have registered for this program, and it just shows how popular and how valued and respected Mr. P. Sainath is among the journalistic fraternity, among academicians, and also uh, with the professionals from the social development sector. And I'm particularly grateful to Mr. Sainath because you know where he is now. He's in Los Angeles, and the time there is 4:30, and he has agreed to do this session, getting up early in the morning and talking to all of us. And I really don't know how we can thank him enough. And it's always wonderful to interact with Mr. Sainath. And I mean, I'm really looking forward to this session. And now I hand over to my colleague, who is a fanboy of Mr. Sainath, to say a few words and introduce Mr. Sainath.
Uh, First of all, good morning, sir. This is Yogesh Pawar,
Hi,
and
Yogesh.
I have been a big fan of yours ever since I was a student at TISS. So I cannot tell you of how many goosebumps I'm getting just with the idea of getting to interact with you. Um, I want to first of all start with saying that there are not many journalists around who have spent nearly 4 decades in journalism and have got 40 awards of international standing, huge awards, including the Magsaysay Award. Uh, the this kind of celebration of a journalist is very rare to come by, and it is not completely without any reason. It's because he has continuously held on to his conviction and reported on issues which many people want to invisibilize, many people don't want to talk about. When the mainstream media was not talking about these issues, he kept on keeping them center stage, particularly the agrarian crisis, when 3 lakh plus farmers have died since 1995. If this issue was ever reported on by mainstream media organizations, including journalists like me, it has only been thanks to Sir P. Sainath, who all of us fondly call PS Sir. And it is only because of PS Sir that we've been able to do this. So it is truly, truly a great honor. And I think there is a lot that one can glean and learn from him in a masterclass like this. It is a very rare opportunity. And I must say, we are very thankful to you, sir, for agreeing to do this masterclass. Thank you so much. I would ask you to begin, sir.
Pleasure. Thank you. Thanks, Yogesh. Thanks, Sharda. Let's begin by looking at it this way. By the way, I just call it in the People's Archive of Rural India, of which I am founder editor. To be honest with you, I don't use the word development reporting or development journalist. We call it the everyday lives of everyday people. Because development itself is a very contentious word, and we really don't know who means what when they use that word development. Whether it is reporting NGOs, or is it reporting the construction of infrastructure, bridges, railways, roads? What the heck does it actually show us? And so let me begin by treating journalism as an applied social science. If we go back, I'm very sure that no one of you is going to tell me that you're satisfied with the way the pandemic, or as I call it, the three pandemics, were covered, right? No one can claim that we did a great job of covering the pandemic. I mean, I'm speaking on the media as a whole. There were so many brilliant individual exceptions. But let's look at what would we cover if we were allowed a chance to return in time and do something about it. What would we cover if we were looking at 3 or 4 major issues? The collapse of employment, 118 million jobs lost in 1 month, as the CMI, as the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy tells us, in the month of April 2020. How would we cover the migrations that took place? Now, we followed this very closely in Pari, in the People's Archive. And you'll find more than 200 to 250 reports on livelihoods under lockdown. And I don't know how many stories on reporting the migrations and weaving that into the employment issue as well. Now, for instance, the vast majority of Indian media audiences, and indeed several editors, are still unaware of the fact that during the COVID-19 pandemic, especially the first few months, we saw the largest movement, migration of human beings in recorded history, far greater than that at the time of the partition. And yet, how does one reconstruct what happened? Because say a decade from now, 2 decades from now, researchers are looking at newspapers and channels. What would they see of the coverage of the what was called the reverse migration? There is a week or two when the newspapers, channels are full of this. Okay. But if you go back and analyze them closely, you'll see that mostly it was that the migrants were accompanied up to the city border, because magazines and newspapers and channels are not really interested in poor people who do not produce revenue for them. Corporate media is not interested in that. They will spend lakhs of rupees sending a reporter to cover the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, costliest city in the world at the time of the forum. But they're not going to really send reporters to accompany the migrants beyond the city's borders. That, I think, is something to be considered. What we did. Now, second, who does the labor? Who does the labor in Indian society? And what are the kind of gaps that are brought on? Many of you must be, looking at the discussion where, women's work participation has fallen severely, etc. And actually, well, in some cases, you can see a return or a slight improvement in the figures. How should we understand women's labor? How should we understand the work that is done? Are we going to look at it in terms of share of gross domestic product? What are the ways that we're going to look at it? Actually, presently, all the ways that we look at it, tend to completely marginalize and play down what the role of female labor is, not just in India, but in the world. In 2020, just before the pandemic, in fact, the ILO came out with some numbers on unpaid work for women and um, girls in just the care sector, in looking after your relatives and looking after people, in working um, round the clock, fulfilling all the chores of the household. But the bulk of the work women do is unpaid. It therefore does not reflect in your gross domestic product. Right? Horribly gross, isn't it? But it does not reflect. As a matter of fact, the ILO figures, also analyzed quite well by Oxfam, show us that how they actually make an attempt at quantifying the amount of unpaid work that women and adolescent girls do every day, every year, in every life. Would you believe that the number of such, the quantity of such work, women and adolescent girls do 12.5 billion, that's billion with a B, 12.5 billion hours of unpaid work every day, right around the clock, around the year, every day, every year. And that's unpaid work. Even to try and imagine 12.5 billion hours of work being done within 24 hours. What does that amount to if that work were paid? So the ILO tried applying that. The ILO and Oxfam applied that to how do you quantify what would be the payment if they were paid? So they took a region-wise look at minimum wage in given areas, in given locations. Asia Pacific, whatever, and even brought it down more at a country level or a regional grouping level. Took an average minimum wage and tried figuring out what the value was. They arrived at this figure. The value of that unpaid work annually or totally is $10.8 trillion. $10.8 trillion is bigger than all your four tech giants or three tech giants put together, than the market value of your tech giants. Now, we are alarmed about women's work participation rate figures, the fluctuation, it's going down, or maybe it's coming back. We're not looking at the fact that if we started paying for these services, those numbers, and then therefore they would also be counted in your GDP, it would alter the face of economics as we know it. Yeah? It would alter the face of all the calculations that we make as we know them. So a very important thing, and by the way, once the pandemic broke, the amount of care work actually went up. Women and adolescent girls in their household. But we never really went into it in terms, we did in the People's Archive of Rural India, but we tracked what work women were doing, how the load went up, and in fact, by the way, how domestic violence went up. With the guy back in the house 24 hours a day, there were very major increases in domestic violence. I would say the first thing that we needed to have done was to look at the migrations, to look at livelihoods under lockdown and what happened to them. We needed to look at women's labor, apart from all the other livelihoods. Within these livelihoods, what happened to women's labor? And that would have been an entirely different telling of the story. As a matter of fact, to this day, the Indian media has not done a credible estimate of the number of lives lost in India under COVID-19. Just consider that the WHO placed the number of Indian lives lost during the COVID-19 as 4.7 million. Lancet gave a figure of 4.2 million excess deaths in India. The Global Council for Development, DC, said 4.9 million Indians could be counted as excess deaths or deaths due to the pandemic. Johns Hopkins gave 3 separate lists of estimates, etc., all in the millions. You choose your favorite million. Indian officialdom said 481,000, and that's it. And India is the world leader, right? We have managed it better than anyone else. When the Vishwa Guru has spoken, you all just have to shut up. Now that figure was revised upwards modestly to a little over 500,000. Yeah. And we have even seen boastfulness in the media about how brilliantly we covered the pandemic. Not covered the pandemic, how brilliantly India managed the pandemic, a lesson for others. It's a kind of very dangerous delusion. It's dangerously delusional to think that we did brilliantly, either as a society in countering the pandemic or as media in covering the pandemic. Yeah. If we haven't even been able to look at, so how many Indians died? I'm not looking for a figure with pinpoint accuracy. You're never going to get that. But a gap of 90% in the estimates between estimates in this country and estimates of organizations regularly looking at such issues, something is wrong. Yeah. We have we've really not looked at what the heck happened during COVID-19. Let's go to the migrations. Yeah. If you look at it, on March 31st, 2020, the attorney, do you think we did a good job of covering the migrations? And then we can talk about how does one cover migrations? How does one cover a migrant? Yeah. On March 20th, March 31st, 2020, the Attorney General of India told the Supreme Court, the government of India presented an affidavit. There is not a single migrant on the highways at this moment, as of now, March 31st, 11 a.m. Not a single migrant on the highway. Not a single. So, the official position was laid out. 14 days later, the same court heard the government in another affidavit, in another communication, saying 23,000 food relief centers had been opened across the country. 23,000. Failing to mention that 62% of the, firstly, if there was nobody on the highways from March 31st, what were you opening those centers for? Who were you trying to serve? I mean, what was it? Was it ecotourism for backpackers or whatever? You have stated in an affidavit as the official position of the government that there was nobody on the highways. On April 14th, 2 weeks later, you say you opened 23,500 blah blah centers of food relief, and you do not mention that 62% of those 15,273 centers were opened and operated in the single state of Kerala. Almost nothing up north. Very poor. Second, now in a situation like this, how do we figure out what numbers actually moved? When the reverse migration started, there was a lot of hand-wringing and anguish in the media editorials, if you go back to them. Why are they going back? They should not go back to the villages. They should not go back to the villages because there is a much better chance of their getting medical assistance in the cities. Actually, I think the people who decided to walk back had made an extremely rational and correct decision. Imagine that they stayed back to be looked after at the tender mercies of our middle classes, which in 20 years or so when they had worked for us, we never even asked them which village they're from, how many children they have, what is the work that they do back in the village. So when Pari interviewed many of the people, we didn't accompany them to the border of the city. Our reporters visited their villages, often going with the migrants. Yeah. You want to cover migrants, you want to cover migrations, you have to be a migrant. Now, in what maybe you would classify as development reporting, I think this is one of the most fundamental truths. If you do not go along with the migrants, if you do not yourself do that journey of migration, in 30 years, every year that I kept 250 days or 270 days for work in rural India, I kept about 40 days for migrants. You'll find that a lot of the stories I did are the bus to Mumbai, stories like traveling 36 hours in the bus with, and then later 18 hours in 2000, 36 hours in 2003, in 1993, and 18 hours in 2003, from Mehboob Nagar in what is today Telangana to Mumbai or nearby areas. Those journeys were more educative than any amount of theorizing or listening to collectors' quotes or some officials' quotes or even some NGOs' assessments. Here's a simple way we measured the migrants. In 1993, we got the figures from the Andhra Pradesh State Road Transport Corporation. 1993, the number of buses between Mehboob Nagar and Mumbai, one bus a week. And that you changed the bus twice. So you were traveling in 3 buses by the time you reached Mumbai. In 2003, there were 42 buses a week, which showed that migrations were massively growing. And I'll come to why in a little bit. In the pandemic period, there were other ways of looking. See, when any major thing happens, you'll find that different government departments are putting out their own data, not necessarily knowing what the other department has said. It gives you an opportunity to pin down the broad figures. The latest thing that happened in data, as you know, was with the Institute of Population Studies, whose director was simply thrown out because a guy who presides over the National Family Health Survey, the data, the figures they were putting out quite honestly, quite diligently, contradicted the claims that the government itself was making about a number of issues. So the man is first suspended, an outstanding researcher, a person of known integrity, and then finally eased out of the place totally. Yet, the cat is out of the bag. In the pandemic, it was very curious. The Attorney General kept giving the court updates after having said there was no one on the highways, of how many relief centers, how many food centers, all of this, they were giving them updates. And then the railways let the cat out of the bag totally. Remember that from March 25th onwards to middle of April, millions and millions and millions of human beings were walking home, trying to get people to getting private fly-by-night van and truck services to get to their villages, but millions simply had to walk. Finally, in around late in the game, the government recognizes, though it does not announce, that there is an extremely serious problem of migrations undertaken in terrible heat in the months of April and May. And they start the Shramik train. This is where reporters begin to get their figures. On May 26th, the Indian Railways put out a proud a press release, and which, by the way, I completely congratulate the Indian Railways. I think it was a phenomenal job. Those of you who remember the pandemic, remember those were called Shramik trains to take workers back to at least a broad area near their destinations. The railways released a figure for 25 days, May 1 to May 25. They transported 91 lakh workers. That's the figure they gave, official figure. Now, those of us who travel with migrants and travel in rural India know one thing. When they say 9.1 million people were on these trains, they actually mean that 9.1 million tickets were issued. The number of people traveling on those tickets is much, much larger. The Indian poor have a very healthy attitude towards public transport. It's public. It's for us, so they travel. I know that when major groups travel, as I have traveled with them often, it's often thought enough, if there's 100 of us, 25 tickets is good enough. Anyway, 9.1 million people were transported in 25 days by the Indian Railways on their own account, by their own account. So how many people did travel? You know that there were 2 months, there was a full month of April, and a week in March in which people were already walking. If you look at the various things that district administrations, others had put out, what we know today is that not less than 20 million human beings walked back, boarded trains, boarded the tops of buses, boarded trucks, and went back. That is one of the greatest dramas in human history. How did we cover it? And even as this drama went on, there was the parallel thing of denial of the number of deaths that took place, denial of the number of scale of migrations involved, denial of any great problem at all in terms of the migrations. How does a reporter work in that? As I said, the only way is you be a migrant. Let me tell you another thing they did to squelch. You all know it because it was a law. I mean, it was announced as a GR, as a rule, as a fatwa. The movement in April, that movement of human beings on the highways was banned between 7 p.m. and 7 a.m. And I think you'll remember that the 16 workers who got run over near Aurangabad, Jalna, that side, or by a train. And maybe that had something to do with it. But they did this, that you had no right. I mean, you were violating the law if you walked on the highways between 7 p.m. and 7 a.m. Guys, please think of this. What was that rule doing to ordinary people? If you're a reporter interested in human development, you're a reporter interested in how human beings live. If you're interested in all these things, you'd have to first and foremost realize when you ban traffic of human beings or traffic between 7 p.m. and 7 a.m., you are condemning those millions of human beings in April and in May in 40 degrees, 42 degrees heat to walk between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m., the hottest hours on the hottest days of India's hottest months in a very hot country. Yeah. We have had no investigative journalism of how many people died, not of COVID-19, but of muscle fatigue, out of dehydration, out of simple body muscle failure. There's a little story we did, and where our reporters went back to her village. There was a 12-year-old girl called Jamlo. She was an Adivasi chili picker in Telangana, but her home was in Chhattisgarh, some 200 odd kilometers away. Yeah? It's one of those things where half the village comes to a particular area in another state because they've got a thing going with the landlords, the labor contractors in that area. Well, the landlord simply said, look, it's lockdown time. We can't do anything for you and you can't stay here. Go back. So the reverse migration there started. And little Jamlo walked 160 kilometers in the heat and simply fell dead. 60 kilometers away from her mother's waiting arms, 12-year-old Jamlo fell dead. We have absolutely no idea of how many Jamlos there were during the pandemic. Get back to the reverse migrations. With all the bleeding heart editorials, why are they leaving? Shouldn't they be staying here for a better chance of survival? We actually put that question to the migrants. And they gave us a look which said, I mean, there was almost an element of amusement. The unspoken question was, stay behind and depend on you guys? You guys, who in all the years we've worked for you, never bothered to ever ask us, how are you today? How are things at home? How is your family doing? And you are going in the middle of the pandemic, terrified by the very sight of us coming near you. You're going to be looking after us. Yeah, so sure, we may die on the reverse journey, but better to die amongst loved ones than be an unnamed corpse on the street. That was, I think, a perfectly rational decision. Secondly, and more importantly, as reporters and journalists, the question that the media and the editorials and several intellectuals were posing, why are they going back? That was entirely the wrong question. It was entirely the wrong question. Why are they going back? I think Yogesh knows the real question. The real question was, why did they leave their villages and come here in the first place? And the answer to that is two words: agrarian crisis, which destroyed tens of millions of livelihoods in the countryside, swelled the ranks of rural migrants in urban cities. And look at the hypocrisy involved. We are saying this is a good thing. We've got to get more people off agriculture. They've got to go into industry. We didn't open a damn industry at any time with very substantial amounts of employment for people of that class, of that background, of those occupations, of those skills. Yeah, they ended up in the cities being your nanny, my driver, someone else's tailor, or my carpenter, or whoever. When we showed that bleeding heart anguish, we were really bemoaning the loss of our cheap labor. The question of why did they leave in the first place takes us back to the biggest pandemic of all in India, inequality and the agrarian crisis. Right? So rather than, it's when you get that picture of what happened, since 1995, nearly 400,000 farmers have taken their own lives in official statistics, which you'll find in the National Crime Records Bureau. Nearly 400,000 are the estimates. And that is a very gross underestimate. It excludes large numbers of women farmers, since we don't recognize women as farmers in our society. We think of them, in law they are, but we think of them as farmers' wives, farmers' mothers, or farmers' daughters. A reporter wanting to do work on this should know that over 60, perhaps 65% of all labor done in agriculture is done by women. Okay? You don't know these basic figures. It's a question of how much curiosity we show in the lives of others. How do the media actually cover such people generally? The Center for Media Studies, Delhi, Professor Bhaskar Rao's foundation, pulled out figures for me from 5 years. The average Indian national daily, national in single quote, that gives 0.67% of its front page news space to news of rural origin. Now, people living in rural areas, that's 69%. And that's 69% of the population in your 2011 census lives in the rural areas. And space on the front page, 0.67%. If you proceed to the inside pages, all the social sector, your social development reporting, all those beats together do not get the amount of space that crime and entertainment do in India. And as you know, crime and entertainment majorly overlap in Indian journalism. So that is the truth of how, when we are not covering them, when we are not covering village education, we are not covering, um, you know, education below college level in any serious way, when we are not covering health in the countryside, when we are not covering these regularly, it is not an accident that we will fail, and our failure will be colossal to let our readers know what actually happened during the pandemic. There was 1 month in the pandemic where there was some brilliant coverage. And that was when thousands of bodies piled up along the banks of the Ganga, the Sarayu, and other rivers in Uttar Pradesh. You saw some spectacular coverage of that. It lasted 1 month. At the end of which, and it all ended once the state government and the central government pulled the plug on government advertising in the media. Now, the whole problem of media based on a revenue advertising, on an advertising revenue model, was shown up in days. Everybody shut up. In Pari, by the way, we did not shut up because we do not carry advertising. We think there's enough crap being sold to kids in a very in the media every day. We don't carry advertising. But when that plug was pulled, most publications folded and caved in tamely. When I say this, I'm not talking about the alternative independent media. I'm talking about the giant corporate media. One major newspaper did otherwise. And that paper was Dainik Bhaskar. What happened to Dainik Bhaskar? When the others pulled out, they kept reporting this stuff. They were raided. I don't know how many government agencies visited Dainik Bhaskar, but they took a pretty severe beating as a message and a lesson to the rest. The thing is, more than a year after the last lockdown, the story of the pandemic and its impact on ordinary people is yet to be told. Please understand that development reporting is a very political process. Understand that there is politics in everything that happens. When I went to... So anyway, the fact is that we actually made a colossal failure collectively in the large, what we call mainstream media, what I call corporate media, because I don't see how we can call a media mainstream that excludes the mainstream, that excludes 75% of the population, 80% of the population. When we are saying that, when we just look at it another way, I gave you the numbers of how much these sectors are covered. All of you are journalists. Go back to your newspapers and magazines and channels and find out how many reporters there are on different beats, and which are full-time beats. When I joined journalism in September 1980, almost every newspaper, I think every newspaper, had a labor reporter. Try finding me a labor reporter Today, the Times of India or someone else will have a guy called industrial relations reporter. Yeah, he's talking to industry about whatever he's talking to them about. And he gets his connections with labor through the PROs of the industry. I get calls from some of these guys asking me, can you suggest the name of a trade union leader and give me his phone number so that we can get a quote from him? Yeah. He's just a rent-a-quote guy for you. He's not a representative of millions of human beings. Right? So the labor reporter died from the late 80s onwards. Today, we do not have a single correspondent full-time covering on a national basis, covering farming. Oh, yeah, I know. Agriculture correspondent. The agriculture correspondent is very often someone who is covering the agriculture ministry, not farming. Sometimes we have had agriculture correspondents in the time of Mr. Pawar, for instance. The agriculture correspondent's job was to cover the agriculture minister, not farming. The number of, if you find me full-time reporters covering farming from the fields, from the mandi, from the homes, from the work of the farmers in this country, that would be wonderful. I'd love to meet them. In reality, they're like the Yeti, often heard of and spoken of, but I was the only guy ever to hold a post called Rural Affairs Editor. That itself should tell you something. Yeah. And that would not have been possible but for an enlightened editor, Enram, who felt the need and importance of such a coverage. So here we are at one level done with the context. I didn't want to get into specific single stories with you. I want you to think about how much work and preparatory work you've got to do before you go into any place to cover it. Now, for instance, covering migrants. How many kinds of migrants are there? How many kinds of migrations are there? Does the average journalist, because I'm not blaming the journalist, they've never been put on such beats. Such beats don't exist in the Indian media. So how would they know? Unless you do your own reading and don't get it from WhatsApp University. There are many, India is a land of migrants and migrations. There are seasonal migrants. There are short-term migrants. There are long-term migrants. I am one, a long-term migrant. There are what you call chain and relay migrants. You know, the first person from Ramanathapuram, Tamil Nadu, arrives in Dharavi, Mumbai. And when he has settled himself there, or she has settled herself there, then other relatives begin to join them. It's also like the the Punjabi peasants' journey to Canada. Yeah. So there are these long-range migrants also. Unless you know and determine which kind of migrant you are tracking, what kind of migrations, yeah, your census gives you an unbelievable figure of who migrants are and migrations are. Again, you need to get past the cliches and the shibboleths about who migrants are. For instance, migrants are mostly understood to be men. Now, it may be that there are more men migrating than women, and that maybe that men migrate first. The common dismissal of women migrants is that they have changed location because of marriage. Okay. This is it conceals more than it tells you. There are millions and millions of women migrants. How, if you want to cover anything in the name of development, you're going to have to cover migrants. Yet, look at our hypocrisy. On the one hand, we are saying it's good that agriculture breaks down. There's too many people on agriculture. Hand it over to the corporations. Let them bring efficiency. Let people go out and be absorbed in the industries which we never created. Yeah, public sector industries shed a couple of million jobs or more in the last 30 years. Now these people come to the city where they offer us cheap services. And what is our plan in the city? We plan smart cities, which will essentially create enclaves that will service 2 to 3%. Now, the Indore smart city, its blueprint and design shows you that it will not serve more than 2.8% of the existing population. So you're going to actually have a smart city, a smart apartheid, where you're encouraging, where you are incentivizing with the crackdown on employment in agriculture, you're bringing millions and millions of people to the city in search of decent work, in search of livable wages. And we create a Xanadu, an enclave, a Shangri-La within that, in which they cannot live because they're not planned for. It's smart cities for you and me, guys. Yeah. The entire movement of things. It boils down in many ways to how the homework you do before you approach a subject. It boils down to who you consider sources. Now, the standard method of reporting in rural India is that big city reporter goes down. First port of call in the district is the collector, so that you get a briefing from the collector about what's going on. Half the times, the collector is a new kid on the block. Maybe someone who came from Rajasthan and has been in the Maharashtra cadre and who has been assigned a district, a highly complicated district like Osmanabad or Bede, and has lived there 3 months on that posting when you meet him. That person is supposed to be the expert. No. For me, the farmer, the laborer, the people who have tilled the land of that district, some of them for 40 years, 50 years, they know a hell of a lot more than he, you, I, all of us put together on the problems of agriculture. That's why our slogan in Pari is everyday lives of everyday people. We tell the stories through the voices and lived experience of people. And by the way, we do it with the most complex subjects. We do it with something like climate change. Yeah, how we cover it, etc. Unfortunately, I have not prepared or equipped to share screen on all these issues with you, but you can look at Pari. You can look at how everything is done through the voices and lived experience of ordinary people. That is the greatest source and resource to you if you have that first quality required in a journalist, which is curiosity about the lives of others. If you have that curiosity, you're going to make a great reporter. If you have the curiosity and follow up on it from the point of view of the survival strategies of the poor. Now, and how poorly informed all of us are on our own society and our own country. Just look at the fact that in 1990, how much, I call it 3 pandemics, and the second pandemic ongoing, first was COVID. The second ongoing pandemic is inequality. A lot of the problems we discussed in the last hour, and I'm winding up so we can have questions and answers. A lot of the problems we discussed have sprung from inequality. And that inequality has grown like never before since 1991, when we moved away from the principles of the Constitution, the preamble, and the directive principles of state policy, and moved into a market as God, into a market fundamentalist framework. In 1991, there was not a single dollar billionaire in India. Today, there are 174. And the maximum number of them in any given period, we created 68 billionaires during the 24 months of pandemic and lockdowns. And in India, is there any investigative stuff on that? That the largest number of billionaires are not from IT or high tech. They are not from manufacturing. At the close of the pandemic, they were from the health sector. 32 billionaires from the health and pharma sector, 31 from manufacturing, 16 from IT, which means the number of billionaires spawned of health, of exploiting the costs of people's health, is double the number of high-tech billionaires in your country. Yet, but this phenomenal performance has put us number 3 in the world. And the media are very proud of it. Each year we report how many new billionaires we have. Number 3 in the Forbes billionaires list. Okay. How does that compare? And this list, the government never attacks or criticizes or anything. What about, how do we rank on other lists? The country that ranks number 3 in dollar billionaires in the world ranks 132 in the UN Human Development Index. And immediately we start attacking those, saying faulty methodology, poor methodology, they don't know what they're talking about. By the way, the Human Development Index of the United Nations was originally designed by Amartya Sen and Mehboob Haq of Pakistan. Okay, I'd say these are people who knew what they were talking about. Nothing is perfect. Nothing gives you total accuracy. They give you trends. Number 3 in dollar billionaires in the Forbes list, 132 in human development. In the global hunger index, we have fallen to 111 out of 121. How many of us are doing stories on hunger? In the global, in that IFPRI index of the global hunger index, we used to be 94. We are now 111 out of 121. In the World Press Freedom Index, which I had something to do with from the Indian government side also, we are now at 161 out of 180 countries. In the Environmental Performance Index, and as you know, South Asia is going to be a climate change hotspot. Already is, Emmett. In the Environmental Performance Index, which is a joint exercise by Columbia and Yale universities, we managed the impossible last year of ranking 180 out of 180. Okay. So there we are. Of course, and then in the VDEM, the Democracy Index in Sweden, I don't know what the latest number we have fallen to, but it's pretty bad. And anyway, it's all dismissed as conspiracy by people jealous of India. So guys, if you're going to do reporting of what I call everyday people, everyday lives, which to me is what development is about, the human development, then you're going to have to do a certain self-education. One, you do not do stories from quotes from experts. By all means, talk to experts, but foreground the voices of people at the front line of impact of whether it is climate crisis or COVID-19 or whatever it is. If you want to cover migrations, be a migrant. Before you get out into the field, there's a huge amount of homework you do before you reach that village. We can discuss that right now, in a minute from now. What kind of stories you do will end up doing. It's very similar in journalism and in photography. I maintain that the first important thing in a photograph is the intent with which it is taken, which will shape, influence, perhaps determine the quality and nature of your content. Yeah. So there's a hell of a lot of stuff to be done before you set foot in the village, before you set foot in the field. And then begins another set of very, very important things that we've discussed. If you have the knowledge, if you know, done your homework, it's not ever going to be difficult to find stories. Stories will kick you in the face if you have a perspective, a lens that is, as we began with, gender sensitive, but also caste sensitive, class sensitive, regional sensitive. All these other factors come into it. Thank you. I'm going to end there, and we can take it forward now from questions and answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was really, really very hard hitting. And yeah, I think we need to have this kind of waking up from people who've been working at the ground level. And I hope all the participants and all of us understand that it is not, just writing about some social development issues, but getting into the roots of it and understanding it, and having an experiential understanding of the issue. Thank you so much for that. And now I ask my team to facilitate the Q&A session.
Could you read out the questions from the chat box for me, please?
Yes, we'll do
I'm
that.
having some irritating glitch with my Zoom box. Yeah. Anyway, go ahead.
Yes, I will just do that. Give me a second. So we have a first question from Professor Angelo. They are asking, do you feel that the genesis of underreporting factual data lies with the political environment? How big was it a contributor of the silence of reporting?
Okay. It's a very, very valid and serious question, but there are two things. It says something about who we are as a society. Our prejudices, our discriminations, all of that go into the kind of data we produce. Okay. Arbitrariness in data and in data collection. Look, it's going to vary from place to place. Data collection in Kerala, in the census, is going to be far more robust in Kerala generally than it will be in, say, Eastern UP or Bihar. Because there's far more public awareness, far more consciousness, and people question it. Okay. There are three things that you can look at. One is the terrible underreporting, first and foremost, has to do with the ownership, nature, and structure of Indian media. our media are largely corporatized. They're not going to cover Jamlo on a regular basis. Little Jamlo who died. They might reproduce the story we did. But Jamlo, the thing is that corporate media are exactly what they are. They're corporate. The bottom line is the bottom line. The beats in a newspaper and channel are determined on the basis of what brings in the revenue, what brings in the advertisers, what advertisers are going to, produce um, large budgets and spend them on your channel or newspaper, if what you're covering, the section is not going to buy the products of that advertiser. So you have no farming beat, you have no beat on labor. And when we say that, therefore, we are making a statement. When we don't have full-time farming correspondents nationally or full-time labor correspondents nationally, we are making the statement that 75% of the population do not make news, do not matter until once in 5 years when they are voters and not human beings. When they are merely voters, then they make news. The nature of corporate media, as the media corporatized in the last 30 years, you can see the different beats being phased out, thrown out. As I said, when I joined journalism, every newspaper had a labor correspondent. Corporatization of the media will absolutely ensure that poor coverage is not an accident or a failure, but a result of the design, structure, and nature of our media. That's the first thing. Second, I say this with qualification to individual journalists. Hundreds, I believe this country is richly endowed in wonderful journalists. But journalists do not make policy in the newspapers. They do not make policy in the channels. In the last 30 years, one of the things we've had to understand is the divergence and distinction between journalism and media. 30 years ago, you could use that word interchangeably, but journalism and media divorced each other in the late 80s. Media are, when I speak of media, that's institutional. Channels, portals, newspapers, magazines, radio stations, these are institutional, they are media. If they're corporate owned, they will function on corporate lines. The second, journalism, is what guys like you and I do for a living. It is very different. Our priority is, why did any one of us join journalism? Yeah, to boost Mr. Vineet Jain's revenue. I don't think so. We joined journalism to be able to connect with our society. We joined journalism with the idealistic notion of, which I'm fully supportive of telling the stories of our people in the help that journalism could work as one of the tools of social change. Don't ever develop messiah complexes that I will change the world. I want you to want to change the world, but don't think that you are doing it all on your own lonesome. Look at others. Anyway, the next, so one side is the data, the priorities of media make it clear that you're not going to have serious underreporting. And you're going to have that by design, by decision. The second problem is the nature of data gathering in India. Yeah, the nature of data gathering in India, we are a very arbitrary society in most places. So data is gathered. Let me give you one example. Some of you, if maybe Professor Angelo himself or herself would have been present at the NSS investigators' activity sometime in a village. By accident or design, you may have run into it. Once the government of India was doing a survey through the NSS on, they're called thin sample surveys. And the survey, like what I was talking to you about the last 1 hour, was completely devoid of cultural context, of political context. These are very, very important things indeed. All data are also political. Now, so this thin data sample was based on a single question. Have you and your family had 2 square meals today? I can't count the number of errors there are in one sentence, in that one question. First, what is a square meal? What is a meal and what is square? Two, what is which 2 meals in a day? And three, who are you asking that question? Head of household. In India, we automatically assume that the head of the household is a male. We will ask that question of the head of the household while his wife is standing by, who actually knows how much who has eaten. The male head of the household is the guy who eats first and eats best. Then you feed the children, then you feed the aged parents, then the woman eats last and least. She knows exactly what everyone has had. Yeah. But your data, you address your questions to head of household, assumed to be a male, even though 19% of rural households are even by census count, female headed. And in a period of great migrations, there are districts like Anantapur, where surveys have shown that 40% of households are female headed for substantial periods of time. So our prejudices as a society, like in the counting of farmers' suicides, those come in. And the nature of the data can be very, very arbitrary. Like in the census, I think the Indian census is the most remarkable document in the world, but there are huge problems. It's a great thing when you look at the aggregate numbers, because errors of omission tend to cancel out errors of commission on a large basis. But if you disaggregate, you get into the figures of Adivasis, for instance. You're going to get into all kinds of trouble because of the lack of knowledge, sensitization, or interest of the surveyor and the prejudices that go into that. Yeah. Then third is the government attitude towards the data. We have been in the last 10 years, we have seen major NSS we take major consumer expenditure surveys and suppress them. We've killed data, saying that the data is of poor quality, etc., because it tells us very, very damaging things about what actually happened in these last years. So there is the government decision making, there are our social prejudices, and there is the corporate media's character, which conspire to do this deadly underreporting, which can literally be deadly. Yeah. Hello. Yeah.
Yeah. Should we go on to the next question? I hope that
Please.
answers your question, Angelo. The next question is by Ubir. Where are the spaces in this country we can do rural reporting? I mean, organizations that are ready to publish ground reports from rural areas about their lives, their routines, their health, education, and their hardships. Can you help?
Depending on the language, Ubir, there are journals that do that, but they are necessarily the small journals. There are newspapers, there are much more of it is going to happen online because newspaper publishing is too expensive a business. Now, there are People's Archive of Rural India welcomes contributions from freelancers, provided those work within the mandate of We don't, for instance, accept essays. We don't accept your, I just hate it when a reporter goes somewhere 800 kilometers and writes about his or her emotions on what they're seeing. You've got 1,500 words. Please talk about the people that you're going there. Don't give me your emotions and your. I don't want to do. Yeah. So the thing is that if you are willing to do that, if you are willing to look at Paris mandates, which keeps foregrounds the voices of ordinary people, if you're willing to do that, we publish such stories. We publish a hell of a lot of stories from outside contributors. We pay for those stories, and we publish every day in 15 languages, including languages like Chhattisgarhi, Bhojpuri, apart from all the major languages. So we exist. And I will also make this claim that 20 years, 25 years from now, anyone wanting to know how ordinary Indians lived, worked, danced, played, drank, dined, died, is going to have to look at Pari. We cover culture, we cover every single aspect of rural life, of ordinary people. And we cover a lot of urban India because we cover what we call the rural in the urban, the migrants who have come to the city. Yeah. So we exist. There are other journals that publish good stories on the basis of there being good stories. There is Wire, there is Frontline, there are other journals. And in the Indian language, there are journals. So it's not that they don't exist, but you have to figure out what it is they want you to cover, what is their mandate, and see if you're interested in doing those kind of stories. Yeah. Also, it's not just that someone does a story, we publish it. We have a very elaborate process of vetting the story, editing the story, which we do in collaboration with the reporter. It means that we pitch the standards very high. But we allow reporters to grow with us. They learn, we learn. Yeah. And I understand your frustration. There are actually very few of us, and we do not have the giant reach of the mainstream media. But we are not going to get that. We're not going to get that reach by sitting on our backsides and moaning about it. We go and do the reporting. We do the stories, and we've grown with it.
Thanks, sir. Hello.
Yeah.
Yeah, sir. As you said that you actually want reporters to grow alongside you. I would basically, as you said, rural reporting doesn't exist in today's mainstream media. So, as a young reporter, I want to report. I want to grow along with you. Would you give me that opportunity? That's what I wanted.
Why
I
don't
know.
you get onto the Paris site and write to us and contact us? I cannot give anybody a guarantee that anything you send us will be published.
No, no,
We
I'm
go
not
through
saying
a
that.
long.
Yeah, yeah, sir.
Yeah,
Yeah, sir. I
please listen
understand
to
that.
me.
Yeah, yeah,
I'm
please.
saying I heard your question. So I'm saying yes, you can. You can, but do it. There is a process. You get onto the website. There's a contact us. Get in there, write to us, send us a pitch. Our editors will look at it and get back to you, whether
Thank,
it's going to work or not. Yeah.
thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Obi. The next question is from Mohak Gandhi. Migration within the country is used for polarization by politicians and always linked to identity politics. Apart from that, migration never becomes an election issue. Also, the media is not taking up the issue. Do you see migration and policies related to the same becoming election issues and part of the mainstream discourse?
I think I spoke at very considerable length on migrants and migrations, and I don't want to repeat myself. But the fact is that, as I said, this giant the period 2001 to 2011 saw the greatest migrations in our history till the pandemic reverse migration. Okay, uh, you can see that those are they policy driven? Of course, they're policy driven. Until 1991 census, the number of farmers in the country is growing. 61, 71, 81, up to 91 census, the number of farmers in the country is actually growing. From 91, when we embraced the new economic policies, liberalization, globalization, privatization, farming enters a crisis. Do you know how many farmers quit full-time? How many full-time farmers quit agriculture between 1991 and 2011 in two censuses? And that is the outflow of your agrarian crisis, which I was talking about. Why did they come here in the first place? In the decade 91 to 2001, the census data, the census abstract on agriculture, you can look at it, shows us 7.2 million farmers dropped out. 2001 to 2011, the number was 7.7 million, meaning nearly 15 million farmers quit farming. Full-time farmers, not part-timers, not hobby farmers, full-time farmers, that is main workers, main cultivators, main cultivators in agriculture. 15 million of them quit in 20 years. You know what that means? It means on average you were losing 2,000 farmers every day. Every 24 hours, 2,000 farmers, or 2,038 if you want to be precise on the number. So they just didn't decide that, hey, I want to go out and see the big bright lights of the city. Something happened to them. The policies that we brought in created that flow of migrations and migrants with the collapse of agriculture. So secondly, incidentally, migrants are those who get to vote least. Yeah. In fact, I've always argued that we should have election timings when the elections timed for when the maximum number of people are at their home base. Because it's very difficult for a migrant from Odisha working in Chennai to go back and vote. How do you make that possible without terrible fraud coming in? It probably can be done, but it's very difficult. You need to adjust migration timings also. I mean, you need to adjust election timings also so that people get a chance to go back to their villages and vote. And is it a politically polarizing issue? You know what happened? It's a polarizing issue in terms of attitudes towards outsiders or whatever. So migrants in Mumbai have at times received very hostile attention from local forces. Now that's going to be happening. I mean, this is your society. This is the nature of who we are. And unless we are able to stabilize on migrations itself, plus deepen democratic behavior and functioning, we're going to have those problems. Yeah. Migrations are a very political issue. Yes.
The next question is from Atharva, who is planning on being a content creator who makes video essays covering essential yet overlooked issues in Maharashtra. The question is the overseeing function of the press capable enough to reform our institutions with such chronic tendencies of greed and incompetence? Or is it incomplete without the benevolent governance?
No, it's not possible in the media, the dominant media as they are today. It's not possible. In fact, there is an incredible amount of greed and incompetence in the mainstream media or corporate media. I was the guy who broke the story in 2009 on paid news on the front page of the Hindu, how almost every major newspaper, bar two or three, were selling editorial space for money. When you're the function of private corporate media is not to look after your knowledge and information, it is to make money. It is to enrich the top shareholders. That comes, sure, they will give you some, of course, they give you plenty of information also. I read two newspapers first thing in the morning, and then I read another two in the course of the day. Okay. But you're not going, are they capable of overseeing institutional reform? Forget it. They haven't been able to look, the media, for instance. Do you know one great thing that this government did, which I supported and applauded? When lockdown was declared on 24th night, 25th morning, midnight, 24th, 25th midnight in March 2020, they listed media for the first time ever as an essential service. Right? Now that I really was pleased because it was the first time it's ever happening, and it would allow us to do our job. Essential service, by the way, means that your job is protected. Your job is protected. You can't go about sacking half the fire brigade when a crisis is on, or any time, because they're an essential service. So when the media was an essential service, I thought, okay, we can do something here. In the pandemic period, the main media houses and many others laid off more than 3,000 journalists, maybe 3,500 journalists lost their jobs, which is absolutely a violation of the category essential service. They used the crisis to lay off thousands of journalists and more than 10 to 15,000 non-journalist media workers. Okay. What about the greed and incompetence of inhumanity of what was happening? Do you know that more than 750 journalists died during the COVID pandemic? Most of them small rural stringers. There were people in Maharashtra getting, in little towns, getting salaries of 4,000 rupees a month, dying. Yeah. And the family is in heavy debt because because they are borrowing money from the sahukars to pay for the hospitalization and treatment costs. More than 750 journalists died in this period. Yeah. And that is a very big underestimate, because we don't have the old kind of journalist unions that has all the data at its fingertips. This is from a number of sources people trying to put together, and does not include data from a number of states for which there is no data. So don't look to the press barons, don't look to the corporate, crorpatis to worry about reforming institutions. They actually, many of your corporate owners, their money comes from government contracts giving them control over public resources, oil, natural gas, mining, etc. They are not going to do anything that will upset the government and lead to the cancellation or cessation of those contracts. Right? Like how in that COVID example I gave you, government pulled the plug on advertising and the critical reporting stopped. So please don't depend on the fox to guard the chickens. Don't do that. They are not, the media are an institution desperately crying for reforms. Journalists is another matter. Journalists, yes, I think there your point is valid and good. We need to be all the time. The minimum duty of journalism is to signal the weaknesses in society. Can we do that? Well, we can try, can't we? We should.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Mimansa Singh. Um, they have worked in Arunachal for the last 2 years, focusing on livelihoods, particularly with women in the region. Um, they're saying, I noticed the blatant absence of reporting from the entire region, including rural areas. As a researcher, I've come across stories that need to be told. How does one ethically record and share these stories, respecting the space and boundaries of the people involved while ensuring appropriate representation?
One, I'm glad to know that Mimansa Singh and his or her colleagues are doing this work in Arunachal. Second, ethically recording, there are very excellent and serious protocols which we live by in People's Archive about what you can do and what you cannot do. But primarily, you have to convince the people you cover that what you're doing is in their interest. And more importantly, you seek not just their consent, but their collaboration with it. Yeah. So it's what I have done as a journalist for 43 years. It's not so impossible at all. It can be done. And I'm happy. We've just published or are just about to publish a second story from Arunachal Pradesh on relating to climate change and the impact on birds, for instance. But we would love to have story pitches from Arunachal on women's labor. We'd love to have that. Please get onto the PARI website, send something to contact us. Yeah.
I'll do
And
so, sir. Yeah.
yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you. Thank you. Yeah.
The next question is from Prashant Bish. Uh, we know media covers what brings them some sort of revenue, which development communication stories don't. Well, corporates are doing uh, what corporates are doing what's best for them, but we as audience doesn't seem to care about any of these issues either. How do you think that we can change that and develop a sense of empathy towards the needy?
Prashant, the thing is, I think it becomes a little too convenient and self serving to blame the victim. Your You have a generation being driven by the crap they get on WhatsApp. You have another generation that lies glued to the TV where day after day, shiploads of nonsense are thrown at the viewers. You are now having that socialization introduced into your school textbooks. The NCRT has thrown out Charles Darwin. By the way, I am in the distinguished company of Charles Darwin. His work and mine got thrown out at the same time. But they are carrying stories in school textbooks in the States which are absolute myth and fantasy. So you've got a problem going way beyond just the media alone. It's your polity, your society. How do you change this? I think that in each, one does not delude oneself that one is the Messiah or something like that. But you can do plenty within the field of journalism. I think today, for instance, the cutting edge of Hindi journalism is happening on individual small YouTube channels. I'm not talking about Ravish. He's big, he's huge, he's the best. But there are a lot of little people, men and women, doing some very, very useful things, setting up their own channels because you can't get that work onto some of the major channels. There's also an element of your creativeness, response, all of that. The other option is to work within that mainstream media and do what I call guerrilla journalism. You slip in stuff. When they burn one forest, you run to the next. The ultimate guarantee in our time is that you will be unemployed. But you can. I worked 35 years in that media, which I'm criticizing. Yeah. So it's possible. For that, you also have to look at the larger movements, the larger processes. Like, for instance, how many reporters connected with the farmers' agitation? How many of us connecting with those, like how many reporters connected with the students protesting on the CAA? We needed that proximity to social movements, to understand better what's going on and be that the process of transformation is not going to be brought through your mainstream corporate media. A journalist is also a citizen. A journalist is also a human being. All these other aspects of it also go into how we aim to create a decent human change.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
The next question is from Srinivas of Deccan Chronicles from Telangana. The government is doing surveys for their policies and frame schemes, but not making data accessible to people and the media with the fear that the policies and schemes may get exposed. How to go about this information? For example, a massive social survey done by government in 2014 in Telangana.
Yeah, well, that's going to call on your ingenuity. You're absolutely right, Srinivas. In the last 10 years, we have seen more cover-up of data than any time previously. There have always been problems of suppression of data. But it has become incredible when an entire NSS survey is killed, consumer expenditure survey is killed, then it becomes a very serious issue. The way, as I said, is to try finding if you can get at least a rough fix on that data from other sources within government. One is, like I gave you the example, that while the Attorney General was blathering about no one on the highways, the railways soon after were saying, hey, we transported 9.1 million people in 25 days. These sort of things always happen in a big state with big government. It always happens. Like the Indian Institute of Population Studies thing, it started putting out data that was contradicting all the bogus claims of government. They were not trying to contradict. They were just doing their jobs honestly as researchers and surveyors. And if we do our job honestly as surveyors and researchers, well, I think we can do something. Yet another way, Srinivas, is that there will possibly, in the government, be some sympathetic bureaucrats, perhaps those who worked on that project, on that survey, from whom you can try tapping or accessing the data. Plus, you do the RTI route, which I'm placing third or fourth because they are killing RTIs these days, and more stuff is being excluded from it. But you have options. You also sometimes can look at other surveys in the past and try doing extrapolations, or sometimes non-profit groups are doing their own surveys on a small scale. All these possibilities exist, but nothing will equal the fact of that survey itself being in your hands. So there comes in your ingenuity and creativity. How the hell do you get hold of it? I think one of the things about Indian government traditionally is it does leak big time. So try that route. Yeah.
Sir, I am Srinivas Pilalamari from Deccan Chronicle. Sir, this is becoming very tough when we are writing, especially in Adivasis and their schemes in tribal areas. The state government is keeping a watch and seeing that we will not get information. Moreover, they are even trying to put pressure. So this is very difficult in Adivasi areas, especially.
Yes, Srinivas, but I'm saying what you can do, like NREGS and in Adivasi areas, there are also groups of individuals and groups of social movements that do what you call social audits. Try looking at that. Look, the in Rajasthan, for instance, the Mazdoor Kisan Sangharsh Samiti, founded and led by Aruna Roy or Nikhil Dey, have really made social audit a very serious issue. And I think that you need to be getting that done in your own areas as well. And I'm very sure, knowing the Adivasi areas of Telangana and Andhra Pradesh, there will be somebody doing something of that. Social audits of NREGS, of tribal schemes, etc. But it's not going to be easy. It's never been easy, but it has been done. Won't be easy, can be done.
Thank you, Srinivas, for that question. The next question is by Sneha Banerjee. Uh, has the new format of storytelling, like short content, podcasts, and newsletters, incentivized meaningful storytelling? What are some of the key points to keep in mind for anyone diving into this space?
You see, there is no one golden bullet or silver bullet or magic bullet. There can be, I think there should be many multiple formats of storytelling. We have about 14 or 15 different formats on Pari. And we keep adding to them if someone convinces us that here's another thing that you can do. Yeah, I think podcasts and things I think it's a very good idea. But please understand that it's not the format alone that determines. Form does not determine content. Content determines form. And that's how it should be. So it's the content. You can have podcasts which are brilliant, great, like you can have news broadcasts that are brilliant and great. You can have stuff that is inflammatory, nonsensical. Yeah. The content, don't lose sight of that. But as tools, is the podcast, these kind of formats, a good thing? I would unequivocally say yes, if you're looking at it as tools. But if you're looking for larger impacts and something positive and stuff, then you're looking at content. And I would encourage you to, experiment with different formats. And please, within podcasts, within whatever you were doing, experiment, innovate, really keep doing an audit of what your content is, how relevant it is to people, how much it helps them, how much it works in letting your readers know, or your listeners know, or your viewers know what the hell is actually going on. And I mean, everybody chooses their own format or forum. I tend to use more than one forum or format. And yeah, I'm sure you could too. I'm sure you're doing that already.
Hello, sir. May I audible to you? My question is how to cover things in terms to get best coverage. What are the factors in it to achieve public responses?
That is too broad a question, my dear. I mean, each and every issue you will might have a different way of doing something. Now the public responses is entirely dependent on the platform that you are working with. Okay, so I mean, if your platform is very narrow, very small, how many people will you reach? All those are issues. So I'm saying that it depends on the issue that you are doing and how you connect it to your particular audience. You know your audience. I don't know your audience. Right? So you'd have to do that. But I would say the simple basic principles are: one, tell the story through the lives of everyday people, ordinary people. Tell the stories through the voices and lived experience of people. It means also, say, suppose you are telling the story of an agricultural laborer. I want you to track that agricultural laborer from morning 4:30 a.m. when she wakes up till the night when she is the last person in her house to go to bed. And again, and that might be at 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, and she will get up again at 4:30 a.m. You will find lots of such stories on Pari, on People's Archive. And as I said, we publish in 15 languages. You can choose which language you want to read the story in. But so that is one thing. As close to the lives of people as possible. Yeah. And then the other thing is to not prose on or editorialize all. Let the story emerge from the characters in it.
Perfect.
Yeah. Rather than I made this mistake in my early years of trying too hard to tell the story myself. It is, I think, much more readable, much more acceptable when there are voices other than your own in the story speaking.
Who's suffering?
Use as many direct quotes as possible.
Awesome.
And give weightage to the person who really knows what she or he is talking about. If I don't want to know from somebody who's done a PhD thesis on pottery what the work of the Kumbar or the pot maker is. We can use a quote from the PhD, but we have to tell the story from the potter herself or himself. Okay, so these are some basic starting points, and then you can take it from there. Yeah.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
As we are running out of time, we'll just take 2, 3 more questions. The next question is from Radha, uh, who said, "Nice to hear you mention guerrilla journalism. I was just going to ask you about that. Back in the day, it was at least minimally possible. How does one do that today?"
It's more difficult today, but I know a number of journalists who are doing it, who do, one of the things I teach my students, and I've been a teacher 37 years, is when you are pushing a story in the publication or channel you're in, always credit the story idea to your boss. Do you get what I'm saying? I'm saying the best idea always came from the boss. That is one way of slipping it through. Tell the boss that, what you said the other day, oh, I had an idea from that, and I'm doing this story. Two, it's not just necessary to fight, but to fight cleverly. You're pushing the envelope, you're pushing the boundaries, you use some excuse linking it to the paper's stated mandate interests. The content of what you do might be entirely different from what the paper does. I know that I did that for many, 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 many years in various publications. However, it is getting more difficult as people are tightening up more and more on revenue enhancing stories only. But the thing is, there has always been guerrilla journalism. I think it will be there. I cannot say comment for you on your individual experience. I don't know where you're located, which publication it is. It varies from that. But I also told you one thing quite honestly a few minutes ago. I said the one guarantee in guerrilla journalism is that you will lose your job at some point. Yeah. But when they burn one forest, you run to the next. So yeah, I mean, that's the only thing I can guarantee you, that you will be unemployed at some point. But the basic driving force of a journalist is that desperate need to tell the story. And that's how it's all happened right through history.
Thank you, Radha, for that question. Adarsh Kumar is asking, please tell us about the coming act going to form within a few days about government control on digital media and current affairs. How will it affect local channels which give rare information?
Whether it's been tweaked or whether it's being brought anew or whatever, the government has already had a devastating impact on digital media and stuff. Incidentally, this is the only country in the world that has had internet shutdowns of nearly a year. In an entire state, we used to call the state of Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir, which they removed the statehood. They also removed internet facilities for 6 months, 8 months at a stretch. That is actually, to my mind, a gross violation of fundamental rights, because the right of access to the net and communication on the net has worldwide been recognized as a basic right. It is a right. But enormous damage has been done. Second, last year there was, in October, I think, a Facebook whistleblower who addressed the United States Congress and revealed all the takedown requests from governments across the world, which Facebook had acceded to. The maximum number of internet takedowns of Facebook posts came from India, more than the next 2 or 3 countries put together, I think. And the Facebook acceded to all these requests. Now, today, every one of you knows that the largest army of paid trolls in the world, which are closely affiliated ideologically to the government, go after you. And it's happened to me quite often. If I reply, I'm going to get that guy 1 million more hits. So you're in that dilemma of replying to an absolute canard or lie, but risking that you will double the coverage that lie gets by responding. So there is also the extra state or the extra legal or extra media factors involved in the kind of stuff that's going on. They've been consistently tweaking law after law after law, like, for instance, the Epidemic and Diseases Act. Samuel Raja Pandian Tamil Nadu, the founder and editor of a portal, a city portal in Coimbatore, early days of the pandemic lockdown, did a story on the lack of PPE equipment, protective equipment, personal protective equipment in the Coimbatore General Hospital. Now, it was very obvious who the sources of the story were. It was the nurses and the doctors who were suffering without it. His paper was raided, he was arrested, and he was prosecuted under the Epidemic and Diseases Act, for God's sake. Then, and the last journalist prosecuted under the Epidemic and Diseases Act was Bal Gangadhar Tilak in 1897 or so. Okay. Now, not only did they use this act to prosecute him, Samuel Raja Pandian and others, they strengthened the act with an amendment. They made it nastier than before. So what they have been doing incrementally, they might now do in one big omnibus amendment or act. Yeah, it's terrible. It's a terrible thing. And I wish you and I had the power to counter it. But that's going to have to be countered by how we stand up and the journalism we do under the circumstances, and how we reach out to the public of this nation and show them how damaging, how anti-constitutional, how anti-human rights it is what's going on in this front.
I hope that answers your question. The
Yeah.
last question that we are going to take, one last question, is by Smita Datta. What is the scope for collaboration between rural NGOs, especially working on livelihoods, poverty, and rural development, and rural journalists?
I should think plenty, but one of the problems with NGO-led journalism is that the story becomes about the NGO, about the saintly founder of the NGO, how wonderful he is or she is. And I think that you have to give up on. Your job is to tell the stories of those people and of the people you work with and help them tell their stories better. I think there can be a lot of such collaboration, but it also depends on the kind of journalists you have access to. And there are publications. I said that if someone makes a pitch to us on a story on rural people, poor people, marginalized communities, we are very happy to consider the publishing of those stories. But also, often we've received stories which we couldn't use because they were all about the NGO and what great work it's doing. I want to know about the people the NGO is working with. The NGO should appear in a couple of lines at the most and be identified so that people can contribute to it or help it or whatever, but it cannot be the main story. And that is a mistake a lot of nonprofits and journalists covering the countryside make. It's one that we try not to make. But yes, can there be collaboration? Oh, yes, there can be.
Thank you, sir, for answering all those questions. I'm sorry if we couldn't take up a few. We're running short on time.
Yeah.
I would request my colleague Grana to do a formal vote of thanks.
Namaste, Sainath. Thank you so much, for just joining us today. I know you've been speaking for 2 hours nonstop, and it's been so interesting. I'm sure everybody here has, received a wealth of knowledge. Thank you for reminding us why we got into this sector, why we got into, I'm from the social sector, but like also why we got into the social sector and for that matter, journalism, right? I remember when I was working at Dasra a few years ago, we were discussing with some of the party members. And the first question I remember asking them was whether you're called Pari or Pari. And very honestly, I feel like, just hearing you today and just in general interacting with your colleagues at Pari, I feel like y'all are storytelling fairies, Paris for rural India, and just in general, the data that y'all cover is so important and useful to everybody. And thank you so much for spending these 2 hours with us. I hope everybody who has joined us for this and everybody who will also watch this on YouTube will be more inspired to write real stories from stories of Jamlo, and share more about the 80% of India's population. And yeah, I think lastly, just thank you to the Population First team as well for just organizing this, for the rest of us to also get a chance, opportunity to listen in. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hetal, do we have a feedback form or
Yes, we
something?
will be sharing a feedback form for all the participants. Please, please fill that and let us know your thoughts about the session. We'll be mailing it to everyone as soon as the session. Thank you, sir. Dr.
Thank you.
Shada.
Sainath.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you all.
Thank you,
Thank
ma'am.
you, Sharda.
Thank you,
सर
sir.
मैं
Bye.
सर मुझे खुशी सर मुझे बहुत अच्छा लगा सर आपके साथ जुड़कर
Very
और
much.
मैं क्या बताऊं मैं हिंदी में बोल पा रहा हूं और मैं हिंदी पत्रकारिता और जनसंचार का विद्यार्थी हूं पटना बिहार से जुड़ा था सर और मुझे अच्छा लगा हेताल मैम आप लोगों ने एक नया ये जो आयोजन किया इससे बहुत कुछ सीखने को मिला सर के वक्तव्य से सर मैं आपके बारे में तो बहुत कुछ पढ़ा या कुछ सुना जो भी था और आज आपके साथ प्रत्यक्ष रूप से आभासी माध्यम से जुड़कर जो मैंने आज सुना सर बहुत ही मुझे खुशी हुआ ये मुझे मेरे लिए तो आप आइडियल है क्योंकि जब आपको एक पुरस्कार से सम्मानित किया गया था तो मैं पढ़ा था एक न्यूज के माध्यम से मगर जब आपके बारे में जाना बहुत कुछ आवाज जब प्रत्यक्ष रूप से आभासी माध्यम से जुड़ा सर बहुत कुछ सीखने को मिला बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद सर
बहुत धन्यवाद आपको भी. Thank you so much. I'm pleased that you came up and told me that. Thank you. Thank you, Sharda. Thank you, Hetal, all of you, Rena. And I'll say goodbye to you now. It's
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you.
6:40 a.m. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yes,
Thank
please.
you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Bon appetit.